Good morning, everyone. This is Robin Wolf. I'm a Senior Program Director for Rural and Native American Housing at Enterprise Community Partners, and I want to welcome you to the Pacific Northwest Rural Rental Preservation Academy session. I also want to be sure to acknowledge my colleague Adrienne Norwood, who's also on the Rural Native American Programming team and is supporting this call and is a tremendous support to our team as we work in a virtual space and as we transitioned to the virtual space last year and now often work in this virtual space this year. We'll do a little bit of exposition earlier on than you might be used to in these sessions. As I said, I work for Enterprise Community Partners. Enterprise Community Partners is an organization with the vision that our country and home, we want to create a country where home and community are stepping stones to more. And our mission is to make home and community places of pride, power, and belonging, and platforms for resilience and upward mobility for all. And the Rural and Native American Programming team, our work is specifically focused on supporting rural and Native communities throughout the country as they work to develop, preserve, and maintain affordable housing in their communities. I must thank our partners, Fannie Mae, JP Morgan Chase, Oregon Housing and Community Services, and the Collins Foundation have been ongoing supporters of the Preservation Academy for the Pacific Northwest and bringing all of these sessions to you in addition to our technical assistance work with the cohort. I also want to thank the USDA, RD Multifamily Office, the Department of Commerce in Washington, and the State Housing Finance Commission, and everyone who's taken part in this academy and all of the guest speakers as part of this academy. It has been a community effort. So just a little bit of talking about where we've been before we get to where we're going today. So far, we've talked about the rural rental housing preservation landscape here in the Pacific Northwest. We've looked at the USDA rural development stock and then really talked through the 515 transfer process, done some real in-depth case studies looking at preservation projects in Oregon and in Washington, and had partners from federal and state agencies come and talk about housing finance that goes beyond USDA RD. We also have had conversations about pro forma development, private debt, Section 538, alternative sources, including energy efficiency sources. We had a session on capital needs assessment, talking through architects and scope of work selection, and a study session for the cohort on 515 more in depth. We most recently hosted a property management session, which also covered disaster preparedness and mitigation. And today we are focused on community and resident engagement. We have one more public session that is specific to the Pacific Northwest that will be on local and state policy. It will be on September 1st. And then we will have a national policy conversation with the National Office of USDA RD and the new director of the Preservation Program, Dan Rogers, on October 6th. So mark your calendars for that conversation. It should be a really good conversation with that team as well. So we are wrapping up and we'll be finishing with how we can advocate for this work, local and state policy, and then again, another conversation at the national level. One thing that has come up as we have this community engagement conversation is, and folks have asked me, well, why is community engagement relevant to preservation? And the other question that comes out of that is, why should I discuss preservation with residents? And here's some real basic things that will kind of level set, and our speakers can speak to this in a much more engaging way. But broadly speaking, we don't want our residents to get caught in rumors and fear that as we're thinking about preservation or rehab, that something through that process will change their rent and that they will no longer be able to afford to live there, and therefore they might move out because they don't understand all of the information. We also want to make sure that we're really listening to our residents and their insights about the property and the neighborhood. And those might not be apparent to us as owners, even as property managers, and certainly as developers. So we really need to ask our residents. And that leads us to, as mission-driven organizations, it's our responsibility to center residents in the conversations. Because if we're not centering our residents, what are we really doing? So that's just a little bit of frame setting as that question has come up about how this fits in with the Preservation Academy. And with that, I'm going to turn the platform over to the amazing culture and creativity team here at Enterprise that is leading the effort to promote a healing-centered approach to our work as affordable housing developers and practitioners. And like our rural work, this is a national initiative of Enterprise, and I personally have found this framework to be really helpful in my work. And that's why we're bringing it to you today, so that it can be helpful to you in your work. So they have a great presentation planned for you, which includes introductions and our land acknowledgement, which I'm sure some of you have been missing so far. So with that, I will turn the platform on over to them.
Thank you, Robin. Hi, everyone. I'm Megan Venable-Thomas, and I'm here with our Culture and Creativity and Healing team. And we'll be talking to you a little bit today about our Healing Center Community Development Framework called Building to Heal. So just like a quick check-in to get us warmed up and primed for the rest of our conversation today. Maybe if you want to drop in the chat your name, where you're coming from, where you're tuning in from, and how you're caring for yourself today. I think it's important, and we'll talk a lot more about this, but that we lead with the restoration that is so important to our work, and ensure that whatever it is, the ways you're caring for yourself, you write those down, that you affirm those, and that you come back to them throughout the day, because we need those. So if you want to just drop your name, where you're tuning in from, and how you're caring for yourself today. Drinking water, very important. Thank you. Taking time to be present, beautiful. Eating properly, yes, spending time with family, super important. Thank you, Nathan. Ooh, eating fresh tomatoes from your garden. Please share. I would love that. Thank you. Going back to the gym, movement is so important. Jess, hi Jess. Lemon balm extract in your water, beautiful. I'm drinking some chamomile and calendula today. Making tea, love that. To be determined. And that is perfectly fine. As long as you're determining it, come back to it. Thank you so much for sharing. Next slide, please. So here's what we're going to talk a little bit about today. We're going to talk about our healing story, what really brought us to this framework, how we're defining healing centered. We'll get into and drill down a little bit into the framework and its strategies and principles, and then how we're thinking about impact in our offerings. So we will get started. Prayer, I love that. Slow reentry after vacation, very important. So this is our team. You will hear from all of us today, and hopefully you'll enjoy our conversation, and hopefully it will incite more conversations to come. Next slide, please. So we want to just begin by honoring all the ways that you're showing up today, all the many things you're doing for yourself, and whatever it took for you to get here, because we know there are always challenges and barriers on our time, but hopefully you're finding the time for rest and restoration as well. And with that, we want to honor the land and the places that we're showing up from. So we'll begin, and we always begin with a land acknowledgement. And so I'm speaking to you today from Boston on the traditional lands of the Massachusetts people. I'm speaking as a Black woman, descendant of slaves who were stolen from their land to come and work the soil of this land that for centuries before it was stewarded, cultivated, and loved by Native people. When Indigenous communities in the US gather, they traditionally acknowledge and honor the ancestral holders of the land they're meeting on. And I'm here today to honor those ancestors, my ancestors, and the lands that connect us all in these spaces across the country we now occupy. Honoring the land means honoring everything we're a part of. It acknowledges our inseparable connection with everything else in the world. It acknowledges that all we do has an effect on everything else. So in honor of all of the directions, we honor the land, the water, the sky, the sun, the moon, and the stars. We honor all living things that share the space with us. We honor the ancestors that came before us and those that will come after. We honor everything that now lives with respect within this space. I ask us to remember that wherever you are in the Americas, you are in Native space, and that there are Indigenous people that belong to that place. May all we do in Native spaces both honor the land and prepare the way for those to come. And now I'll be followed by my colleague, Brandon Jones.
Thank you so much for that, Megan, and good morning, everyone. So prior to joining Enterprise, I led the creative placemaking department for an organization based in Atlanta. And so in addition to overseeing our community public programs, I occasionally also sought out shelters for unhoused residents or connected families with food services. I was familiar with steering clear of local gang violence and even held space on front porches with residents to process the loss and grief that sometimes followed it. None of which was technically my job. None of it was I specifically trained for or even always good at. Yet all of it, at least a little bit, felt like something I had to hold because I was there in their community, in their spaces, and asking them to support my institutional agenda. And then layering on top of that, that as my organization's only Black employee leading these organizing efforts in communities that looked like me, I didn't want to perpetuate a legacy of institutional neglect and harm. So the boundaries of my professional role blurred quickly. And I tried with varying degrees of success to respond with a multitude of services for whatever needs might arise. As is the case with many frontline professionals operating well beyond their scopes. Now, when I think back on those years, it's sadly not any career highlights or community victories that stand out to me. Although, sure, yeah, there's lots that I'm proud of and inspired by. I think instead of the daily pattern of me sitting in my car, unable to move for an extended moment of time before I walked into the office in the morning or a neighborhood meeting in the evening. I think of skipping lunches and powering through with my fourth cup of coffee, then laughing about it with my colleagues as if it were a triumph. I think of the panic attacks that happened so frequently that I thought they were normal. You see, I was conditioned to think that my own well-being was simply an occupational casualty of doing good work, and that given my privilege, I simply had to suck it up and keep going. Because the organization's mission was important, and honestly, I needed my job. Both of which were reinforced by a work culture that had me believe that I was disposable and therefore lucky to have the opportunity to serve. So for better or worse, I carried all of this with me when I stepped into my role here at Enterprise. Exhausted, guarded, qualified and experienced, yes, yet deeply sensitive, insecure, and disconnected from myself. Next slide, please. So it was a great gift to me as I joined my colleagues with me today in dialogues with cohorts of community development practitioners, artists, and residents across the country, that we were able to begin having a different kind of dialogue and cultivate spaces that were safe enough to begin to be truly vulnerable. So we got to hear from our cohorts not only the ways in which communities were beautiful and resilient, but we also got to hear about the hardships, the collective struggles of doing the work, the pain points and the triggers, the ways the practitioners themselves were struggling. My own story reflected and affirmed again and again. You see, we learned that even with the best of intentions, most organizations were actively failing their staffs and by extension, inadvertently causing harm to their residents. Most organizations fail to consider how their own internal cultures impact their external engagements. Yet organizational culture directly informs the potential to perpetuate and/or mitigate trauma within communities. With every discussion that we had, there was real hurt and trauma. Yet also so few opportunities and spaces in a professional setting to process and seek solutions for it. Now, what we were hearing and experiencing was consistent with what the research has been lifting up for quite some time now. That within the field of community development, Black and Indigenous professionals have a particularly challenging task of one, identifying, addressing, and then healing their own traumas within their personal life, be it generationally inherited or direct. Two, reconciling any secondary trauma exposure potentially experienced by working in oppressed communities, particularly if there's an affinity to said community. And then three, navigating organizational systems and work cultures entrenched with white supremacist delusions. As a result, Black and Indigenous practitioners are vulnerable to trauma while working to protect Black and Indigenous people also vulnerable to trauma within systems of perpetual racial trauma. And this trauma has existed for years and is inherited by generation after generation. The last couple of years have brought to the surface all of the many cracks in our system. We see how delicate our sense of security is, how vital our social connections are, and the limits of our mental and emotional capacities. So it's important to acknowledge out loud that in an effort to support our most vulnerable communities, frontline practitioners and organizations are often being crushed by the strain, especially Black and Indigenous individuals, and especially women. In our community of practice tables, we've informally observed over the last year or so signs of increased direct and secondary trauma that's manifested as hypervigilance, avoidance, lack of focus, increased workloads and fatigue, articulations of internalized shame and anti-Blackness, and physical elements that range from headaches, heart palpitations, digestive issues, and insomnia. Now, more broadly, we know this hurt is felt by many throughout the country, regardless of their race, profession, and location. The implications of ongoing pandemics, new and historic, such as COVID-19 and systemic racism, make a clear case for national reckoning and healing. However, it's imperative for our organizations and institutions to step fully into that healing journey, having perpetuated much of the trauma and inequities we see, feel, and experience. And despite what our leaders may publicly express, white supremacist systems only know how to protect and promote business as usual. Without explicit interventions that center healing, liberation, anti-racism, and the mitigation of cumulative trauma among us all, our field will be ineffective and unsustainable. So we created the Healing-Centered Community Development Framework outlined in our paper, Building to Heal, which we're happy to share with you all, with the recognition that if these traumas can be passed down through generations, then we believe so can our individual and collective healing. And this is our offering to start. Thank you.
Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So let's ground ourselves in some of the language we're using here. Trauma is the body's response to a distressing event that makes it difficult for a person to cope. And often we think of acute trauma, an isolated event that happens to an individual like an assault. But what we know is that trauma is more intersectional. It can be acute or continuous and cumulative. It can be individual and secondary or vicarious from exposure to someone else's trauma, like witnessing or hearing it. And chattel slavery, Jim Crow, anti-Black terrorism, lynchings, witnessing murders of unarmed Black people by police, dignity violations are violent and collective, structural, historical, and intergenerational forms of trauma. Racism is one of the most pervasive and powerful forms of trauma in this country, and everyone is harmed by it. Research shows that 90% of people experience a traumatic event in their lifetime, and more experience more than one. Next slide, please. So trauma-informed practice comes from the medical field, but it's a shift in practice that normalizes our trauma experience and assumes that an individual is more likely than not to have a history of trauma, and recognizes the presence of trauma symptoms. It acknowledges the role trauma may play in an individual's life, and it meets it with a better prioritization of people's full humanity and lived experience, and prioritizes choice and transparency. However, it's limited to the symptoms of trauma versus the opportunity of those experiences and what they can provide. Next slide, please. So healing is the body's natural response of restoring health. So if trauma disrupts our health, healing can help restore it. And if we understand that trauma is intersectional, then we also understand that healing is, and is individual, collective, spiritual, cultural, and intergenerational. So healing-centered engagement or practice, next slide, which was coined by Dr. Sean Ginwright, recognizes that we aren't harmed in a vacuum, and thus we aren't healed in one either. And to heal from collective traumas, we must take collective approaches. Trauma-informed hones in on the trauma, and people can become defined by those experiences. But healing defines by the assets that can be leveraged from the person's full lived experience, and focuses on the possibilities that we often limit by what's feasible versus what we can imagine. So with that, supporters of this work must not only be anti-racist. If you go to the next slide, you can see you must have an active effort to work against racism's multidimensional aspects. And also be pro-liberation, which is actively reaching toward liberty and justice for all. And that really takes imagination, because we've only dreamed of what this could look like. Next slide, please. So we had to first tap into our own radical imaginations around what could a workplace look like that radically welcomed us, my colleagues and I. What would it feel like? And what wouldn't be there? What wouldn't we have to worry about? We recognize that asking others to decolonize their workspaces first required us to unpack our own habits, practices, norms that we wanted to lay down and unburden ourselves of in a space that really allowed us to thrive. So we created a space where we could live into our expertise and hold the conditions for actualizing our learnings. By centering our experience and other Black and Indigenous peoples, this is how we conceptualize what we needed in a safe space, with the hopes that as we hear from and center more thoughts, the framework will continually grow. So this framework pushes us to shift our practice, guided by our work in community. And the framework offers principles, strategies, and tools that support individual acknowledgement of racialized power dynamics and positionality in communities. It fosters trust building and collaboration, and really makes space for the restoration necessary to spur radical imagination in us all. In order to imagine something we've never seen in this country, racial equality, it requires a creativity we have yet to fully unlock. And so I'll be followed by Chandra, who will talk a little bit more about the framework itself.
Thank you, Megan. Next slide. So I next wanted to walk through our principles. And so these principles articulate the norms and expectations around how an organization, group, or community will operate into the future. They provide guidance on how everyone in it can contribute through the decisions that they make and the actions that they take. So first, we've outlined what we protect. We see holistic well-being as core to how we operate this. We value cultural assets and see them as foundational for our resilience. We work by prioritizing process, facilitating trust building, and centering Blackness in how we operate as well. We measure our work through better relationships, and we're thinking about the relationships we have with ourselves, the land, and our communities, and really ground that in the outcomes. We always see our end goal as having a more healed and liberated tomorrow than we have today. Next slide. I next wanted to take us through our strategies. So these take us deeper into how we apply the healing-centered principles. These are about the choices that we make, the decisions. And so beginning with reflection, we see as a critical starting point to building more self-awareness about how each of us show up in this work through our identities, the positions of power and privilege that we hold, and also acknowledging injustice and thinking about, through a historical lens, how did we get here? Another strategy is how we involve our inherent assets and strengths and how we then assess that as a part of this work. The next strategy is around restoration. How are we making intentional spaces for healing? And how are we going from conversations to actual action about restoring? Next, we look at investment and how we can build community power and acknowledge that folks already have power and we're just amplifying and lifting that up, and how they can then be able to access the resources that should already be available to them. And lastly, as Megan said, we need a radical imagination to get rid of the things that no longer serve us and replace them with the things that do. And this requires creativity to advance this vision. So next I wanted to talk about how we then are able to evaluate this work. So through our work, we seek to build a culture of evaluation and to provide a process that consistently embeds evaluation of self, project, and the well-being of participants. As a part of this effort, we aim to transform the power dynamics that shape the community development field by centering healing and how we evaluate this work. We make our commitment to healing and liberation clear from the beginning. And as opposed to a logic model that we often use in this field, we created an experiential model to demonstrate how this work feels in our body and how we experience it. And not only that, but how we experience differently, even on our team, how I might experience versus Nella versus Brandon versus Megan. And so we expanded our definition to include ourselves and tested these processes out with our team. We've compiled our discoveries into the model that you see here, and also lessons learned from past years of facilitating cohorts as a part of culture and creativity. And so we begin by thinking about how can we take those principles and really begin to see more well-being amongst community development practitioners. How are we creating spaces for folks to feel that they can unburden themselves and feel more confident in their work and create cohesion? How are we valuing cultural assets? Are we making decisions that are more aligned with community priorities and then allows the impact to be shifting power, to create more familiarity and affirmation of the assets that already exist within communities? And then thinking about how we're looking at process and building trust. And how do we see deepening trust as an important outcome to then create more connection and more agency? We then measure that through our own self-awareness by deepening our understanding of our own journey and the ways that we're also implicated in how that impacts other people and also the land, and how that can begin to repair harm and recognize the interdependence that we have. And lastly, again, how are we always moving our work toward healing and liberation by creating spaces both internally, as I just spoke about, but also externally in terms of how we engage with communities. Next slide. So we've also thought about how we want to frame our philosophy of impact. And so the diagram you see here is from the book Black Fatigue, How Racism Erodes Mind, Body, and Spirit by Mary Frances Winter. And the diagram illustrates how we enter communities at the level of the roots of systemic racism and then work with practitioners so that they can bear different fruits in community. And this is also how we exit communities. We recognize that while we as an intermediary won't be there tomorrow, communities will. And so we focus on preparing practitioners to work with residents. We also recognize that the problems that we want our work to address exist within systems and organizations that uphold them and perpetuate systemic inequities. And so the problem is not the resident. So we can't frame our work around that. And so we begin by identifying where harm exists, who is creating it, what is the motivation and incentives for this types of structural harm and why, and how we can then prepare practitioners within organizations to do the work necessary to stop harm and also understand their role and how their role might be different from a team member's role. Once the organization itself has changed, they can then change the relationship with residents and work with them in a different way that is rooted in a more healing and liberated relationship. And so that's how we see residents and feeling different outcomes and impacts, as I discussed in the experiential model. So in essence, we sow the seeds to get organizations to a different place, to change these enabling conditions so that they can work with residents in a different way and address the problems that our organizations seek to solve. So next, I wanted to go through how we can build together. And so we see our work in these three buckets. And we find that it takes bolstering our individual and team capacity to practice, to try out and try on how we can integrate healing practices. We've also found by shifting our organizational culture to support, protect, and prioritize healing-centered processes as an important part of this work. And lastly, by building national networks to collaborate and do peer exchanges and learn from one another, we're able to work together instead of in silos. And it's this comprehensive approach that allows us to create collective impact within our work. And I will now pass to my colleague, Nella.
Thanks, Chandra. So as you can imagine, and maybe thinking yourselves in this moment, when we share this framework, we often hear that people want some concrete and tangible steps and tools that they can use to apply these ideas in the work that they do in community development. So before I walk through some of that, I also want to recognize a couple of things in advance of getting into the tactical details. So first, I want to say that a lot of the language we use is around practices. So these are things we can keep working on and getting better at. And the tools that we provide are really grounded in this kind of approach. Things like tuning into your habitual responses, or showing up with curiosity, or making space for restoration, even within the context of work. It's not something you can just do once and be done. It's something that you're doing on a regular basis and practicing and improving. Second, also want to acknowledge that my personal how-to guide is going to be different from yours. There is obviously no one single toolkit, as much as we wish there were, for transformational systemic change. And some of the tools are quite simple and maybe things you already do. And others can feel a bit uncomfortable to try. I have seen in my own self how I'm changing as I try some of these practices the reflection strategies alone have really helped me to build my capacity to see myself more clearly and to recognize ways that I perpetuate racist and inequitable outcomes, even when my plans are well-intentioned, and even when I think that I'm thinking explicitly about that. I've also learned to cultivate a level of self-compassion and to invest in my own healing. Often for me lately, it's through writing. Sometimes it's just knowing when it's time to take a break. That's the best tool so that I can show up without defensiveness and so that I can benefit from the lessons available to me in these moments. So all of this is just to say that we do have to work differently. And a lot of the practices are about learning to do that and trying to do that in order that the systems that we're part of can also become different. So with that said, I will give you a quick glimpse of our tools and offerings. And actually you can go back to that previous screen, Adrienne, thanks, to offer the Healing Centered Project screen and the Building to Heal paper, which I put a link to. This is the very last page of that document. So it's easy to find. And I will say that this is grounded, it's grounded in questions. The more striving and searching that I've done for guidance and prescriptions and tools and formulas, the more I have realized that it's not about showing up with answers. It is a really essential tool for me has been to enter a situation or a conversation or a meeting with a question. So the project screen is organized with 3 overarching questions, which you can see here. And as my colleagues have mentioned, this was co-authored with a working group of partners who work across development, artists, designers, cultural organizers from rural Native American communities, small towns, and large cities. So within these questions, you can see on the next page, there are a series of prompts that align with the core principles of the framework. So those dots, the colorful dots, are the principles in the framework or the strategies of the framework. And they can guide you to live up to this intention to center healing in your projects. And the prompts take you more deeply into the kinds of design decisions and process decisions that you have an opportunity to make in the development field. So I'm going to walk through this a little bit quickly, just as an illustration of how this tool goes through a series of questions nested within questions. So in this one, you see they're asking about narrative, process, spaces of safety and belonging for residents. And then on the next one, you'll see under the second question, the next slide talks about paying attention to existing assets, building connections with surrounding resources, and increasing social cohesion. And then that third overarching question that was on the first screen, in the next one, you'll see digs into how you can support resident leadership, optimize for multiple positive impacts, and make co-creation really an essential part of how you work. So this nested set of questions is a great tool because you can bring it to a lot of contexts and from it emerge a number of practices that you can employ. So some of the practices that we highlight in the paper were built out of this foundation. And on the next slide, you'll see just the first of 2 that I'll highlight. One is a cultural advisory group, so convening a cultural advisory group. And it's drawn from those questions I just walked through. And then the next is cultural asset mapping. So these all work with the core questions in this screening tool and go a level deeper to provide even more prescriptive guidance. So I think the next slide shows the cultural asset mapping groups. And then after that, our offerings and tools. Yeah, that's right, Adrienne, thanks. So this is a list of tools I just walked through, and I'll paste them all in the chat after I'm done talking. And I just also want to acknowledge that, as Chandra mentioned, it's really important to us that we're part of convening and building communities of practice and networks of practitioners that continue to grow together in understanding what it means to center healing and community development, and to continue to help this framework evolve. So that's a lot of information that we've just covered for you all in this first part of the session, and I'm going to pass it back to Megan to offer us a moment of closing and transition before we move into the session.
Thanks, Nella. Next slide, please. So we've reached the end of this offering, and that was a lot of information. So we're going to take a moment to take a collective breath, to hold all that may be coming up for you in this moment. And so wherever you are, maybe find a comfortable seat and allow your feet to find the floor. It might be soothing to close your eyes or shift your gaze downward. And inhaling through your nose and out through your mouth, maybe with an audible sigh. And just take notice of how you feel. Maybe notice what items or concepts stood out to you. What gave you comfort or discomfort? What things do you want to carry forward or leave behind? And connecting with your breath, just following the path of the breath in the body wherever it's easy to follow. And allow the thoughts to be there, offering them kindness without judgment. Maybe taking one more deep inhale and releasing everything out. And maybe softly opening your eyes. Before doing anything, just noticing how you're showing back up. And take a moment to share in the chat maybe what's coming up for you now. Thank you for your time and attention and presence. And I think we'll be taking questions whenever at the end of the session.
Yes, we can take some questions now, actually.
Oh, okay.
So I would like to open the floor for questions. There's a couple ways you can submit questions, either through the Q&A bubbles, the chat bubbles at the bottom, or you can raise your hand, and that will allow us to let you speak. All of those are options. So should any of you have questions after that presentation, please use one of those methods to let us know. And I just wanted to lift up, I really want to thank all of you, Megan, Brandon, Chandra, Nella, for your time today, for all four of you being able to be here as part of this presentation. It's really valuable for us to be able to hear from each of you and your perspectives, and helping us to understand how we might apply this work in our work as we do work with our residents directly. One thing that really struck me as we're waiting for some questions from the crowd is the thought of focusing, or we can't neglect our own well-being and allow that to be an occupational challenge of doing good work. I thought that just struck me this morning, I think, and sort of a rush as we think about getting everything done, making sure we have this time, as we just did, to take a collective breath and to reflect, so that we don't continue to perpetuate systems that don't really make sense for those we're trying to serve. And thinking about that social justice lens. I know that I would like to ask a question of this team before we move on to the next speaker. And part of that is because the demographics in the Pacific Northwest are, especially for the folks that we serve in rural communities, are heavily Latino. And I know we talked a lot about Black and Indigenous communities, but I was wondering if there are examples or conversations you've had with Latino communities or Latinx communities around this work. So I offer that question to Nella, Megan, Chandra, or Brandon, if you have some answers or insights there.
So I guess I can try to a little bit, and my colleagues can feel free to jump in. I think the first thing that I'd want to say is, there's a quote that we use in the paper, which is about this work being race explicit, but not race exclusive. And I think that that's a really important distinction to call out. Our work, our framework is grounded in the practice of centering Blackness, but we really believe, as we kind of outline in the paper, that in the process and mindset of centering Blackness, there is space for all that have been negatively impacted by the effects of white supremacy structures to be healed for there to be a space for collective healing for all people, right? So again, there is space in the framework and with all of these principles for many different diverse communities to begin applying and thinking through these concepts, right? Here in the Bay, where I'm based, I'm here in Oakland. The communities that I work with here on the ground are quite diverse. There are a strong Latinx community, but there's also a really strong Asian population here in our neighborhoods as well. And all of these communities have been implicitly or explicitly impacted by harmful, oppressive systems of white supremacy. And there is space in this framework for them and all. We really believe that when we center Blackness, and we use this as a mental and as a very literal process for thinking, then it's quite the opposite of any white supremacist mindset, right? White supremacist is a very kind of exclusive approach and alienates and separates, but we really do believe that centering Blackness as a framework that we've been talking about in our paper is inclusive, is all holding, and that there is space for everyone to benefit from it. While also calling out the systematic and harmful effects that Black people and Indigenous people specifically have endured. Like all these things can exist and there's room for all.
I appreciate that, Brandon, and that was really helpful. Did others want to chime in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to also sit with the complexity of race and racial identity abroad and in this country, because also in Latinx communities, right? There are people who are Afro-Latina, there are people who consider themselves Spanish, and European, there are people who consider themselves right across Indigenous. And so to also recognize the complexity of how even in Latinx communities, Black identity, Indigenous identity, and exploitation and oppression show up, and how, I think, is super important, and a way for people to think about as well, what does it mean to center Blackness in our own community, and what does that look like? And indigeneity, and what does that look like, and how do we think about it? And if those folks aren't here, what does that mean? And how do we consider incorporating other ideas that are outside of our own, or digging deeper into the traditions that are represented by Blackness and indigeneity in our communities?
No, thank you, Megan, for that too. I think that is really true. And especially there's a very large Indigenous lens that can be applied to our Latinx communities, particularly the farm worker communities that are served in rural Oregon and rural Washington. Many come from Indigenous communities in their, home countries as well. And so there's it gets to this intersectionality that we really need to remember and hold as we do this work. So thank you for lifting that up. Other questions? I know that a few groups have said that they have their family demographic or the resident demographic is, Kate said, 85% Latinx at FHDC. We will hear from Annabella and Florinda at FHDC later in this session talking about that. But anyone else have some questions? Thanks, some appreciation from those in the chat and from me here in my my home office in Denver as well, to my colleagues at Enterprise in California, Massachusetts, and Chicago, where all of y'all reign. So thank you for joining us from across the country to share this framework with us. I'm really excited. Angela, thank you for saying and lifting up that we are thanking you for your time and for the call to action to do better. So really, I just am so excited that I work on a team where we're doing this work and where I get to work with you all and learn from you all. And I'm glad I get to share that with others as part of my work. So thank you. And if you have time to listen to what's going on with our residents, not our residents, but residents of our community partners in Washington and Oregon, it would be great to have you continue to sit in and listen on that too. So with that, I am going to introduce you to Brian Ketchum. Brian is the Executive Director of Catholic Charities Housing Services in Central Washington, where they develop, own, and manage a full spectrum of housing options, including farm worker housing, senior housing, workforce housing, and also single family housing. So, Ryan, I'm trying to do my homework, so you can correct me if anything is out of date. They're a member of the cohort, so they've been participating in all of the sessions of the Preservation Academy and are actively working on 2 USDA rural development preservation projects. So we get to spend some extra time with Brandon and his team, with Brian and his team working on that work. And before coming to Catholic Charities, Brian worked at ORF. So many of us on the call are familiar with ORF and the work that they do in rural and farm work housing in Washington. And they have a wide array of service-enriched housing opportunities at Catholic Charities Housing Services. So with that, I'm going to pass it along, Brian, to you. And I'm excited to hear about what you're doing in Washington and with your housing communities.
Thanks so much, Robin. And first, I just wanted to say thanks for the presentation earlier. I think it's really helpful, I find, and humbling, really, to learn more about the work that you're doing to provide that theoretical, conceptual framework that informs a lot of the kind of more practical work that we do, on the ground and with families. And so that's really helpful, I find, and also, just a takeaway that there's so much more for me personally to learn from, and learn about and trying to incorporate those concepts into the work that we do every day. So I really appreciate the time that you spent and the expertise that you bring as an organization and community to drive these questions and be a resource for us on the ground. Go ahead and advance to the next slide, please. So as Robin said, I'm Director of Catholic Charities Housing Services, and we serve 7 counties in central Washington state. And right now we have 25 different affordable housing communities, predominantly in 4 of the 7 counties, which is just over 900 units of affordable housing. And within that, then we have community buildings at each one of our housing sites where we coordinate and provide services. So for our portfolio of housing, we serve a broad spectrum of the affordable housing within the low-income community. We recently did our first permanent supportive housing development. And so, from a services perspective, we're still have a steep learning curve in terms of, coordinating and providing and meeting the needs for for those individuals and families. But about 70% of our portfolio serves farm workers and their families. And then in addition to that, as I mentioned, also we have a single family housing program that provides homeownership opportunities for first-time home buyers. So as you can see here, I won't read through it, but our mission and vision. And if please advance to the next slide. So as I mentioned, predominantly agricultural and farm workers. About 20% of our portfolio serves senior elderly, and then the balance is workforce housing and homeless. Really all the families we serve on our multifamily housing program are very low income. With our single family program, we serve more in the 40 to 80% AMI ranges. Go ahead and advance to the next slide, please. So here's just, again, very briefly, our core programs. As we ventured into single family housing, we quickly learned that the families that we wanted to serve and try and help provide a pathway out of poverty didn't immediately qualify for the homeownership programs and lending programs that we were trying to help them become eligible to be able to access. And so we became a HUD certified housing counseling agency, providing bilingual staff to be able to meet the needs of the residents that we were serving. And then in addition, we have an asset management team that really focuses on the long-term maintenance and operation needs to ensure that our housing portfolio is a community asset for the long term in those communities where we serve. Go ahead and advance, please. And the next slide is just a kind of a visual representation of where we're located within Washington, and just kind of, again, a sense of the concentration of our portfolio in our multifamily housing communities. Next slide, please. So for our resident services program, we really started in 2011 and 2012 to re-envision the services that we were providing. And just by way of kind of quick history, for our organization, the founding vision for our board of directors was two things. One, they didn't want to just provide affordable rental housing. They wanted it to be enriched with services and support mechanisms to help address the barriers of families were facing in the community and to connect them to resources. So that was really core. And we started our resident services program in 2003 as we had just a few housing communities. And the second really founding vision was that they wanted our programs to not begin and end with multifamily housing, but to provide a pathway to help families develop and gain assets and be able to move out of poverty. And so with those two things in mind, then we really began looking at how can we integrate our programs and services better to help families achieve their goals. And so when I joined the agency in 2009, you kind of fast forward, we started with resident services, and we had 3 housing sites and 1 resident services coordinator. And then as we just continued to grow over time, we found that we had 13 housing sites and 1 resident services coordinator. And so our services had kind of been diluted, adding more water to the soup. And we ultimately decided that they weren't achieving the outcomes that we had hoped, simply because we weren't establishing enough of a connection within each housing communities and with individual families to be as effective as we were hoping. So we retooled and revisited this, and we started by conducting a survey among residents at a few of our housing sites to really kind of identify what those core barriers were, to make sure we weren't missing the mark and that we weren't making assumptions about what the needs are for the families. And so we landed on these 5 areas of focus that you see here in blue: crime prevention, education, health, community engagement, and economic opportunities. And to be honest, as we're revisiting this now, we've been having more conversations around crime prevention. and whether that's its own category or does that fall more under our community engagement efforts. At the time, we created it because we wanted to focus on some of the stereotypes around affordable housing and being able to address some of the community concerns and stereotypes that come along with that, and really trying to focus on breaking down some of the barriers between and fear between our residents and local law enforcement. And so you can see some of those, that essentially menu of programs and services that we provide. Most of our time in resident services is spent in education, and it's about if you look at the 5 categories, we spend about 65% of our time focused in education initiative. And within that, then we've kind of built out over the years more programming that really addresses the needs of the families throughout the life cycle of the families. So, most recently, we've really been lucky in the last year and a half to get a grant from a private donor who is helping us focus our curriculum. It's called Creative Kids, and working with parents and kids age 0 to 5. So really focusing on trying to address those early developmental years to help kids be school ready when they get into kindergarten. And then we have these programs here that you can see are more school age children, after school activities, and then college access outreach. We've done college campus tours for students to help expand their horizons, as well as that of their parents, to be honest, because as we were surveying families, we found that more than 70% of the families parents had not graduated high school, and almost 50% hadn't had more of a formal education beyond the 6th grade. And so when we began kind of talking about college access and those opportunities for kids, it was difficult for parents to really know how to support their children in achieving those goals and dreams. And so we've done a lot of work around engaging parents in this process to help them understand what resources are available, what opportunities might be available for kids. Health and nutrition, really, and I should note that, as you look at these, the different, from this menu of items that, that we were able to provide, we're not necessarily doing that directly. We do provide some direct service at our housing sites, but most of this is working with a wide range of community partners that have more specific areas of expertise that we're able to bring into our housing sites and remove some of the barriers about being able to access some of these programs and just awareness of programs. Our community engagement, a lot of what we do under that program is we provide opportunities for residents to come and speak with local legislators around the importance of affordable housing, advocating for resources to help support the building, the construction of additional housing, and really what it's meant for them and their families. And for many, that's an opportunity where once a year we'll bring a number of residents over to Olympia, our state capital, and be able to share their stories of what it's meant for them and how it's impacted them, in an effort to help educate lawmakers on the importance and connectivity of affordable housing, generally, but also as we look at like the social determinants of health and the educational outcomes achieved and benefits by having access to safe and affordable housing. And then that ties in with our economic opportunities, which is really more like financial education and coaching opportunities. And we also connect that into our housing counseling programs and our single family housing development. So go ahead and next slide. So this is a little bit deeper dive into our more specific education initiative where we have segmented it out by age in terms of the activities that we try and provide. So in early education with our Creative Kids program, we're doing 2 times a week now. We're able to increase the frequency that we're on site, and doing small group work with parents and kids age 0 to 5, helping parents understand what's happening, the developmental stages of kids, and how they can easily assist in language acquisition, learning, supporting their education from a very early stage. And then we help assist that and continue that process as they move into elementary and middle school. For the middle school age, we've also been able to connect through programs like a summer camp in our local area. There are a couple. One in the Yakima County is Camp Dudley through the YMCA. And so we've created a partnership with them. So they provide some kind of discounted registration fees. And we're able to then apply to some local community organizations like Rotary or Kiwanis to help create some scholarships to send kids to camp. And I use that example specifically because at that age, for most of our residents and the youth in particular, they get to go to summer camp for a week up in the mountains. It's about an hour away from Yakima. And for them, that's really their first opportunity to experience and engage nature in a way that's not cultivating or harvesting it. And so it's a very different relationship, and it's an appreciation for the outdoors. And for those youth, it really expands their horizons and begins, oftentimes it's the first time they're outside of the valley. And so it really does expand their horizons and broaden their scope of view. And so we use that as a point of engagement to try and get our hooks into kids at that age as we begin talking about and introducing the concept of, focusing on high school graduation and some sort of post-secondary education. So that's really a key point for us. And it's also a key point in engaging the parents, because they have to trust us to send their kids to some camp in the woods and away from them for a week. And so, it really reflects a lot of trust building activity that we do on the ground with families. And we rely on that as we're engaging them in these conversations around high school graduation and post-secondary education. And then, as I mentioned before, for high school age students, we'll do, pre-COVID, we would do generally 2 to 3 college campus tours, and we've developed partnerships with universities, Washington State University, Heritage University, which is very local, community colleges. We have a partnership with St. Martin's University in Lacey. And so we've been able to cultivate these campus tours and connections. And then we've also done, adult basic education, ESL classes, computer classes, pesticide training for parents to help them prevent the, passing on pesticides as they come home and hug their kids, making sure that they change clothes and those sorts of things. So that's kind of our core education programs. And what we began to do back in 2014, as we were first envisioning this kind of revamp of our resident services, is that with the very limited dollars that we have for services, we really wanted to be able to test and evaluate and measure whether or not our resident service activities were moving the needle on graduation rates among our high school seniors. So that was kind of our data point. We decided this is something that we can measure and pretty easily. And so we started at 3 housing sites and measuring graduation rates and providing this kind of programming for resident services. So we distilled our service program down to just 3 sites and then began proving the effectiveness of them as we built out those programs across our sites. And the idea was, let's prove that they're successful and then the funding will follow, hopefully, right? And so it's that if you build it, they will come kind of hope that we began on services. Go ahead, next slide. So as we began doing graduation rates, as I mentioned, we started in that first year was just 12 seniors at 3 sites, but we've continued to expand our measurements. And we're able to do that by just simply calling families, we can track the ages of their kids. And so we call those 17, 18-year-olds and check and see if they graduated. And then we can compare that to the graduation rates, both in their local school district, but also then at the state and national level. And keeping in mind that these are all at our farm worker housing sites. So we're, 99% Latinx, 100% very low income families. And so when you look at that, and we're tracking these rates against that, we've been able to demonstrate now over 6-7 years that we're seeing really high rates of success on high school graduation rates. As you can see here, 91% in 2019, 2020. I think when you aggregate that data over 6 years, we've averaged about 88% graduation rates across those 6 years. And then on post-secondary enrollment, this was 1 year specific, was at 64%. But prior to that, the previous 5 or 6 years, we were about 80% post-secondary enrollment, which includes community college, trade school, as well as four-year institutions. Go ahead and next slide. The rate for last year at that 64%, that really does track nationally with what we've seen in the impact of COVID. A lot of people were uncertain about what college would look like, and kind of nationally, I think they saw a 20% drop in enrollment rates in that particular year. Here you can see this is the aggregated data and the percentage in graduation rates over time. And I find it's really interesting. To be honest, we were quite nervous when we first started this, because when you begin to shine a light on how well you're doing, you're never quite sure what you're going to turn up, right? And so we weren't sure that our graduation rates were going to be higher than the local rates, and how that fared, more regionally and at the state and national level. But so we were pleasantly surprised. And what this really does is, in our own portfolio, is reaffirm that concept that our goal in resident services is to provide access to opportunities. And so that's it. It's really nothing more than that, in supporting families as they walk that life journey wherever they're at. So each family has their own particular needs and issues and barriers to address, but it's connecting them to the resources that are available in the community that they just don't know about or aren't able to access because of whether it's transportation issues or language issues, or just awareness issues of what opportunities are out there. And so we're really excited by this data that we've collected over time, and we continue to try and expand our data points as we learn more. Some of our current roles now that we're trying to track, and it's a little bit harder to do, is what are the graduation rates of the post-secondary enrollment, as we know that virtually all these families are first generation high school graduates, first generation to go on to post-secondary. And nationally, when you see that, those first generation students have really high dropout rates compared to the overall average. And so we're trying to collect that data and be able to analyze, like, how can we support those students in those early years of college, in particular, those first 2 years. But it has been an exciting body of work that we've been able to collect. And as you can see, we're really significantly outpacing those state averages. We look at the Latinx population state average of 63%. And that's of the entire Latinx community, not just, very low income, which would, normally would expect an even lower rate of graduation. So we're excited by that, by the data, and looking to build on that kind of body of work. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So, again, as we continue to evaluate the data, and this really demonstrates that the power of measuring it, right, and being able to shine a light on what's happening in the trends that we're seeing in our communities. You can see that almost half the students are going on to community college, but a full third are going on to a four-year institution, and then 21% going to a technical trade school. Go ahead, next slide. here we have just some images. Maria, she's one of our rock stars. I got to know Maria when she was just 14. Her and her parents came over on one of our community engagement events where we took families to go to the state legislature, and it was really fun to get to meet her. We spend the morning, you get up about 4 or 5 in the morning, drive over to Olympia, which is about 3.5 hours away. It's typically in February, so it's snowy mountain passes to get over. But it's a great opportunity to watch these young students as they go into the state capitol and they look up in the rotunda for the first time and just see this massive body of marble and just this large institution. And in Maria's case, at the age of 14, she really focused on, she wanted to go to Harvard Medical School, and she wanted to be a neurological doctor. And she's really been focused on that since. But it was really neat to see, because over the course of the days we're meeting with legislators, the first meeting, she's very timid to share her story and talk about, how that's impacted her life. And by the end of the day, just this short span of like 4 or 5 hours, you can see her emerge as an advocate and really getting comfortable sharing her voice with legislators. And this is really the first time for these families to meet an elected official. And in this case, she continued to be involved throughout high school and had a chance to meet Governor Inslee at a Life and Legacy event for Cesar Chavez. And nice to note that she recently joined our board. So she's now 21, going to community college, and still has hopes of becoming a doctor, and is now bringing that perspective of having grown up at our housing sites now to our board, and informing and sharing that experience with our board of directors. So we're really excited to see that. She has an incredibly bright future ahead of her, and just an emerging leader, I think, in our community. Go ahead, next slide. And here you see just a picture again. This is of Camp Dudley. Part of our partnership with the YMCA is that we send one of our resident services coordinators there for the week. We bring about 20 students now to Camp Dudley each year, providing opportunities. And some of them get to go back as camp counselors as they continue to grow and expand and share their experiences with the next group that go forward. Next slide. Again, so this is one of the things that we've done is in terms of our community engagement, especially with the youth, is we've done and we've helped them apply for a Yakima Youth Award that celebrates their achievement and what they've done. And in some cases, this can be a group of students. So in the past, we did a community project where we built a community park adjacent to one of our single family housing developments. And we had we had like 15 or 20 youth that received a group award for the Yakima Youth Engagement, which is really exciting for them to get acknowledged for their work in the community. Next slide. And here's again, just one of our college campus tours and a group of students that we were able to take to go and visit and learn more about what college campus looks like, to help kids get excited about, these kind of beautiful manicured campuses that is just jaw-dropping for them as they get to go for the first time and experience that, and helps spark that interest, in wanting to continue and focus on their studies and what those possibilities might be after high school. Next slide. And there you have it. That's really just some highlights for our program, and you can go ahead and close the PowerPoint if you'd like. There's contact information for us, and I'm really sorry that Sandra wasn't able to join us because she really heads up our resident services program and has really been instrumental in building out our different areas of focus. And again, education is certainly our lead. We're also working on building out our health and nutrition programming and getting residents connected to resources in the community, and also trying to track and demonstrate the, as we all know, the social determinants of health that are related to having safe, decent, affordable housing and what that looks like. One of the other areas that we're hoping to expand in terms of our data collection is looking at on our single family program, as we build out. So we built about 225 single family homes over the last 15 years. About 15% of our homeowners come from our multifamily housing sites. So we're able to see that progression of opportunity for our residents. But we haven't done a great job of tracking their educational outcomes for our homeowners and making sure that our homeowners are connected in with our multifamily housing sites in terms of resident services and the activities that we're able to provide in the community buildings, and extending those to our homeowners and tracking that. So stay tuned. We're working on building that out, in the years to come.
Thank you, Brian.
There, maybe turn it over if there's questions.
Yes, we'll open the floor for questions. And I do have one question for you, Brian, because I think resident services, I think we all can agree, those of us who are on this call at least, that resident services are important, but we also, most of us who are working on this, on affordable housing, know that they're hard. They're not often funded above the line as we're looking at like our development pro formas. So first question is, how do you fund the resident services, and how did you get your board to prioritize or to lift this up as a priority for what you wanted to provide to your residents?
So second question first. We're really fortunate that our board has always been supportive of resident services, and again, part of that founding vision for our organization. So the will has always been there from a leadership perspective and governance perspective of the board. For us, so when we were looking at retooling our resident services back in 2009, probably 65% of our budget for services came from our development activities in affordable housing. So it was really heavily subsidized by the agency's, unrestricted revenue sources. But that's not sustainable, and it proposed a lot of risk because we're active in development. That's our business model, and so the fees that are generated through development fund our agency. And when you have that kind of programmatic dependence on what is an uncertain and highly competitive source of revenue, that provides a lot of vulnerability for our agency overall, and very specifically for resident services. So we started to try and map out a more sustainable way to do that. And we went back with tax credit investors, and this has certainly evolved over time, right? So we learn as we go along. But our goal was to try and better balance that. And so at that time, we were trying to get to a model on services where it was 50% was coming from unrestricted funding from the agency, 25% through kind of a negotiated resident services fee that might be paid in the cash flow distribution on the tax credit side on an annual basis. So assuming there's cash flow available. And then the other 25% is kind of, grant writing, which has its own challenges. I mean, typically they're smaller grants, 5 and 10,000. And then sometimes they're larger grants. Noting like Enterprise Community Partners has funded our education initiative in the past as we built the capacity when we were retooling that and revisiting it. They really helped launch us with the capacity building grant to hire our second resident services coordinator to help lead and track the education side. And I'm really, so the challenges are that the grants are very variable across the year, and you kind of never know where that funding is coming from. We've had some success with our resident services fees, and the challenge is that it's not guaranteed, right? It's all dependent on cash flow. And so as you're balancing needs for the property, that you're weighing some competing interests there. But we've learned over time how better to structure those tax credit deals to where there might be more cash flow available to us as the general partner to help, again, support those. And the two things we usually use cash flow for is, again, within our own agency, is those competing interests of balancing it for asset management and the long-term sustainability of that asset and making sure that that's well cared for, and then our resident services program. So, there's always healthy tension within that, where we try and have thoughtful conversations around what those priorities are. And sometimes that shifts from year to year as to what those needs are.
Totally. Yeah, I can see that for sure.
We've benefited from a long-term grant on our creative kids side that's allowed us, I would say the fun and exciting thing is when we were revisiting this, we kind of put together what we would like resident services to look like in 10 years. And the idea was we wanted to be able to provide, 20 hours a week of resident services at each housing site. When we started, we distilled that down and we were only doing 8 hours a week at 3 housing sites. So 1 day a week at 3 sites. And then that allowed 2 days for kind of more case management work or building out the structure of the program that we were hoping to do, building the connections with other partners. And now we've been able to expand where we're able to be on site 2 days a week at almost all of our housing sites. And we now have 6 resident services coordinators. So it's now from employment, we're 23 people as an agency staff. And so that's one of our larger programs between that and our single family housing program, kind of our 2 largest staffing, which is exciting to see. When we built it and we thought like, okay, this is what we'd like to see, not really knowing where the funding would come from. And certainly there's, you build it, again, on that hope that you're demonstrating the success and that's going to resonate with somebody or a foundation or an organization to help fund that. But we certainly haven't, I wouldn't say, figured out how to do that in a model that's is confidently sustainable. So we try and evaluate that each year, but we have had some success here recently in finding some donors that this really resonates with.
That's fantastic. I think at some point I want to look at that 25%, how you figured out how to get that into your resident services fee, because I'm sure that others could benefit from looking at that as a model too, thinking about it in that way. So yeah, so we'll talk about that, and we'll be able to see how we can think about it more broadly as a tool for others who haven't. And even though it's only 25%, it helps give that some continuity. Year to year, you'll have a baseline. I also think, just shout out for anyone who might be on the call from a state agency, this is why funding nonprofits to do LIHTC work goes back into things like resident services and the developer fee, as opposed to working with a for-profit developer where that developer fee might go into, it could go wherever it wants. So anyway, that's my nonprofit plug on that. Larry did ask, do you use soft measures of success as well, like resident retention or resident satisfaction, happiness?
So the short answer is no. We're trying to develop a better survey model, and we're looking at ways to do that more quickly using technology, to be able to do quick surveys, to better gauge, their contentment and fulfillment being at our housing sites. The challenge is largely technological barriers for families that we're working with, and how to do that. Now, in the last couple of years, there's been really huge gains in, the ability to reach out to residents through cell phones, and that's really restructured some of the way that we engage with residents, as opposed to kind of what we more traditionally have done were paper surveys among families. I would say, We haven't analyzed retention rates, although I would say anecdotally we can do that through our property management software, and we use a third-party property management company. So the challenge for us is the data is there, but we ourselves don't control all the access to the data points that are there. But we're working on that, I would say, and that's a goal, because all of our families have to do annual research as well. And so we also, the data is there to be able to track how families are doing from an income perspective as well. Are they going up? What's impacting them? What are those turnover rates at our housing sites, which generally speaking are very low. I mean, I can think of a number of families where their kids grew up at our housing sites. In Granger, for instance, there's still a few families that were original families from when we built it that are there. Their kids are now grown, and they've moved on to their lives in the community, and the kids are no longer living there, but their parents still are. And that's really what gives us a very unique window, I think, into more of like a longevity study of what the impact of affordable housing is, because you do develop these relationships with families and you see that and you walk that journey with them throughout the course of their lives. And that's really, it's incredibly energizing and really, I think, motivates the work that we do. It really inspires me. And I would say that, in doing the presentations, that, the stats that we provide and measure are really us claiming credit for the hard work that the families are doing, right? Like, all we are doing is providing access to opportunities. And I strongly believe that is the barrier. The removal of that barrier allows families to then go on and achieve their own goals and dreams within their own lives. And we see that. We see families opening businesses within their single family homes, and going on to do these great things. Single moms starting up daycares so that they can both meet the parental needs of their kids, as well as earn income, and support their work. So that's really exciting to see. And again, that's not us doing that work. That's just helping them, connect them to opportunities, and then they just run with it and they do amazing things. And we try and capture that and share those success stories with others. But it's really sharing their success, and we're just trying to help put that out into the community more. So.
Yes, I appreciate you acknowledging that. Thank you so much, Brian, for talking to us about your programs. And we're going to hear from some resident services and programs that are being provided by Farm Worker Housing Development Corporation, or FHDC. And we have with us Anabel Hernandez Mejia. She's the Resident Leadership Coordinator for FHDC, and she leads the Promotores program, as well as other strategic initiatives that support the residents at FHDC. And her work, Anabel, draws from her experience working with and advocating for underrepresented communities. And she is particularly passionate about serving the Latino community and using her range of skills to advance and uplift Latinos in Oregon as through her work at FHDC. You can see she's in front of a new building that FHDC is working on right now with that beautiful mural. I'm always inspired by seeing that mural behind the FHDC folks when I'm on the call with them. So Anabel, with that, we will turn it over to you, and Adrienne will put your slides up.
Thank you very much. And thank you for having me. So hi, everyone. My name is Anabel Hernandez Mejia. I am the Resident Leadership Coordinator at Farm Worker Housing, FHDC for a lot shorter, right? So next slide. What is the Promotoras program? The Promotoras Comunitarias program is a community leadership program that supports natural leaders and also nurtures leadership traits in others. I'm a bit cheesy and romantic, so one way I like to put it for myself is I'm helping residents dream again. And also tying that down to reality. In all, we're growing skills, polishing talents, and so residents can support not only themselves, but their dream becomes part of a shared one. Next. So how does this look like in reality? The promotoras serve as an extension of resident services, and while resident services, not only with helping that, but they along with that, they're doing training and building skills. So for us in resident services, we get that extra hand to better reach residents, and then at the same time, they are able to help us identify needs or issues before they come bigger. And in that, the promotores also learn hard and soft skills while applying them. So in these pictures, you can see that for a full year, the promotoras in Woodburn delivered over 180 boxes on a weekly basis to the residents of FHDC. So, and then the next one is where they're taking computer classes, and I'll speak about that a little bit later. Next. All right, so how did we get so lucky? Who here has planned an event and thought this is an awesome event, a great idea, but when it comes to it, you only have maybe a few people show up? One of the things to really be considering when you're answering the who, what, where, when, why questions is think about if you're being purposeful or are you setting up barriers? Unfortunately, one of the things about this is that if you're not being purposeful, you're likely unknowingly setting up barriers. So I'm one for analogies. Next slide. I'm one for analogies. And so how do you reach that gem, and how is it that we remove that sediment that's in between us, right? In my case, I work with a lot of Latin Americans, farm workers specifically, and while Spanish definitely is that dominant language, it's not the first language for many of our residents. And not only that, we also have residents who do not have strong literacy skills. So one of the things that we have to do is not only consider the languages for them, other barriers that end up existing end up being location, making sure that we have things on site. One of the other things that you want to consider is when we were planning some of the trainings is, not doing things during the regular office hours. While it is very convenient for everyone that participates, any trainers that might come in from outside, partners, even myself, you are eliminating automatically over 50% of your participation pool. So, again, it's being open and making sure that anybody who wants to participate can participate. So, again, going from going a little bit back with the language as well, it's not only making sure that everything is culturally or language relevant for them, but at the same time, we really avoid using terminologies that were intimidating. So for example, when we did this, we avoided leadership, we avoided advocacy, all those terms that would automatically turn off residents because they would think it's kind of far beyond them. And then again, other things that we were considering were not only the time, but as well as providing food. So again, you're having farm workers getting off of work, and I would have residents sometimes arrive late because before they arrive to the meeting, they're trying to feed their husband, their children. And so, you eliminate that again by providing food. And lastly, with the children, making sure we had either funds to help them with their babysitting costs or having it on site. And just lastly, one of the things to really also keep in mind is, imagine working out in the field, hard, strenuous work, and coming back to have to do something that felt heavy. We always try to keep things light and also fun, incorporating some of that. So it becomes one of those things that, you just want to show up. You feel comfortable. It just kind of energizes you. So keeping those things in mind. Next. As far as the curriculum goes, it is completely need-based. So one of the things, for example, is we did the computer literacy classes for the promotoras. As the pandemic hit, everything was moving online, and we discovered that the promotoras had vastly varying knowledge of computer skills. Some of them had some basic knowledge, others had absolutely none. So again, on a need basis, we ended up incorporating computer literacy classes for them, as again, that transitioning was happening to online. A lot of what we do, and much like this presentation has gone. We've gone a little bit from taking things into theory and putting it in practice. And in doing that, we also make sure that we're providing a safe space to build and practice before doing any of these things at a peak point. It serves the promotoras to get familiar with what it is that they're doing, the process of it, again, in a safe environment. So when they're confronted with it, there's no panic, any anxiety when they're going through that process. And one good example I can give with that is building the resume and doing a mock interview. So with the promotores, we ended up going through and all together building a resume, and we had a mock interview for everybody. And what this does is when they're out there and applying for another position outside of field work, they're familiar with the process. And with that familiarity, they're going to have more confidence. And it's going to help them with their presentation versus not really knowing what's next, what's happening. And that sort of level of uncertainty that could just bring them down a lot further and even prevent them from taking on some of these opportunities. In the case of a lot of these, so for example, public speaking and building community, a lot of these are really intertwined, and we worked on them in a similar way as building blocks. So for example, something very simple that would be distributing flyers, just posting them on the doors. What we did is that we changed it so that it hit several of these other things you see here, which, relationship building and public speaking, giving information. And the way we hit a lot of these points was we really, again, in a safe environment, practicing things where you're blurring the lines of public speaking, where, again, the promotores feel comfortable kind of stepping out of those comfort zones. They would knock on these doors and hand out information instead of just posting a flyer. And with that, you eliminated, literacy barriers. So again, in our property, and this is years back, I don't know what the current numbers would be, but FHDC identified over 9 native languages just in our properties. Obviously, Oregon has more, like possibly around 26. But again, because there's different literacy levels in our residents, instead of having residents rely on their children to either read to them, translate for them, we had the promotores knock on the doors, provide this information verbally. And at the same time for them, it was good to get that practice communication one-on-one with their residents. They were also assigned to a same area, so they always went to the same residents. What that also helped with is, they were helping build relationships with those residents. Also, as far as the residents go, they started seeing the promotores as a leader. They were a source of information. So if they had any questions, things like that, they knew who to go to. So again, you're having this sort of dynamic happening in multiple levels, multiple ways, with just something that could be as simple as posting flyers and tweaking that a bit. And then with, again, taking some of those aspects and building upon them, what we would do is we would then have little workshops where they learned how to put together a story, put together their testimonies. And from doing that, we would then go and have the event where we were at the state capitol advocating for housing, advocating for licenses for all in different aspects. Next slide. All right. As it was already being discussed, resident services really is a key to success for affordable housing. And much like FHDC's motto, home is just the beginning. And resident services, helps and also catapults these success stories, helping residents navigate through these systems that tend to have a lot of barriers, and just simply the fact of not knowing of whether it be their rights, where to go, again, navigating systems that are completely new and different to them. And it does get very difficult because with no secure funding, I personally got hired on with a grant. And while these are great, they provide great opportunities. One of the things, or downfalls about going grant-based is that when you start and stop programs, you can actually have a negative effect when it comes to creating that trust and that community building with the residents. So again, it is a difficult balance there, but I actually want to, next slide, introduce Florinda, who will provide a testimony and just, again, a testimony of what these programs can accomplish, especially if funding's available. Florinda, I will, and by the way, I'll translate at the end for anybody. Florinda.
Hola a todos, mi nombre es Florinda Herrera. Soy madre soltera, tengo 3 hijas y yo he estado trabajando más de 19 años en nurserías y estoy viviendo ahorita en los departamentos de Esperanza Cor, en donde he estado viviendo como más de 15 años. Y lo que me ha gustado a mí de este lugar es que nos ofrecen programas y recursos disponibles para todos los residentes y los cuales no solamente nos ayudan a sobrevivir, sino a sobresalir. Y un ejemplo de esto es el programa de promotoras comunitarias, y en el cual yo he participado y ahora me han dado la oportunidad de trabajar en FHDC como servicio al residente. Y realmente este trabajo para mí es muy satisfactorio porque se siente bien ayudar a las necesidades de los demás. Gracias.
So Florinda shared that she's a single mother of 3 daughters. She has worked in nurseries for over 19 years and has been an FHDC resident for over 15 years. One of the things she states she likes about living on these properties is that the resources and programs that we provide help residents, not only all residents, but that they help them survive and also thrive. Case in point, she participated in the Promotoras program, the pilot program that we had, and it's given her the opportunity to now join FHDC as a resident services coordinator, work that she says she finds very gratifying and being able to help other residents as well. Amazing, right? Imagine what we could do if there was actually secure funding that went to resident services. Next slide. And, as this goes on, this isn't really the only story. As Florinda stated, the impact that you have, and it's not about just you yourself as an individual and how that applies to your family, but also the community. It's about when you climb higher, that you bring others along with you. And as you see here, the group that went to the state capitol to advocate for housing grew. And that's what we want is, people that go through these experiences, that they take that knowledge and they take all that and help others come up too. Next. So a home is just the beginning. Along with Florinda, I'm very happy to report that out of this first group, we only have 1 promotora missing in this photo, but out of this first pilot program, we have a new homeowner. Aside from Florinda, there are 3 others that are full-time employees outside of field work with different organizations. One of them is part-time in a temporary position with a sister organization. And we've had 2 of these promotoras speak with politicians that are known at a national level. The first one was Julian Castro, who was under the Obama administration. And then the next one was Secretary of Labor Marty Walsh, who is under the Biden administration. If we take that onto the state level, there's a lot more. And then really all of these continue to help the community because this is really what it's about, right? So the Promotoras Comunitarias program has been instrumental in creating food, health, and resource access to help families and their communities. And now with that increased confidence, and they have also helped FHDC build stronger and more equitable communities. And I think with that, I might have sped through a little bit more, but that might provide some additional time for questions and answers.
Fantastic. Thank you to Annabelle. Thank you, Florinda. Also, I really love this program, and I wanted to make sure we highlighted this program as part of this presentation, because through the Promotoras Comunitarias program, you have this model where you're building skill sets for the promotoras themselves, and also you're getting information out to residents and languages that they speak, especially when you're thinking about the fact that first language, there's at least 9 native languages on property. And so it's a really interesting and important model to lift up, and a way to build skills and then also promote social justice and equity, and get your residents closer to resources. So any other questions from the group about the Promotoras program, or about the work that FHDC is doing? As you have heard from both Brian and Annabelle and Florinda, the communities that we did lift up today are primarily farm worker housing communities, and are predominantly Latinx. So just to give a sense of the demographics that those properties are serving. No questions? I do see an extension of gratitude to Florinda and Annabelle in the chat. And I would, of course, like to thank them for their time as well. Okay, with that, again, some more gratitude coming from chat. And with that extension of gratitude, I would like to thank you all for your time. I want to really thank the guest speakers today. If you think this information would be of interest to others in your organization or to other partners, there will be a recording of this, and we will also be sending out resources like the PowerPoints and the Healing Center Framework link. So look out for that. There'll be an email coming to you from Adrian. There will also be a survey coming your way. I'd love to hear feedback on this session. And again, please share it with others, because I think we had some really great discussions today, and want to again extend my appreciation to Megan, Brandon, Nella, and then Brian, Florinda, and Annabelle, as we leave this session, and we leave you with 5 extra minutes in your day to hopefully find a little bit of restoration before you have to go on to your next meeting. Have a lovely rest of your day, and we will see you in 2 weeks, September 1st, for the local and state policy session. Thank you all.